With Tom Watson, I'm delighted to see here Labour's deputy leader. Now,
hi, Robert.
We're going to talk a bit about referendums and all of that in a minute, but you also gave what I thought was quite an important speech earlier this week, because you are the first senior person in one of the two major parties, I don't know for how long, who actually stood up and said there is a patriotic case for staying in the EU. Now, why do you think that so few senior current politicians are simply unable to make that case?
I think right now politics is focused on the day-to-day. We've been focusing on this failing deal for 3 years. But actually, after those Euro elections, with the Tories in their leadership election, us reflecting on the result, there was a sort of moment for pause, I think. And for me, I just look back at our history. We've been talking a lot about Harold Wilson today. I mean, Harold Wilson said that...
So in the shadow cabinet?
In the shadow cabinet. Harold Wilson once famously said that the qualities of a good Prime Minister are a good night's sleep and an understanding of history. And so I went back and looked at it and I realised, the case wasn't made in 2016 in that referendum for... the people who created the European Union, they did it because they wanted peace and they wanted economic collaboration. And I just felt I needed to be honest with myself just to get that point over.
I mean, I have to say, I remember that referendum campaign incredibly well, and I was struck at the time that almost nobody made the case for the kind of stability it brought to the whole continent, including Britain. But we are where we are, and you have been passionately for some time in favour of a referendum on whatever form of Brexit is eventually decided upon. There was this important shadow cabinet today. Has Jeremy Corbyn, your leader, signed up now for it to be official policy that there will be a referendum, as far as Labour's concerned, in all circumstances?
Yeah, on any deal there will be a referendum. Our deliberations continue till next Tuesday. Jeremy felt it was very important that he consulted Trade Union General Secretaries and our National Executive Committee.
And the gap is presumably that you're not clear yet whether Labour will sign up to campaign for Remain in this. Is that the uncertainty?
Yes, how you would campaign. And so next week is going to be quite an historic meeting, I think, because, if we do end up deciding we're going to campaign to remain in the EU, it's kind of history-making. And I think that's quite important, because we could be electoral history if we don't make a clear statement of intent.
And so just to be clear, for you, and obviously Labour, like the Tories, actually has been rather hammered in recent elections and in the polls, for you it's not enough for Labour simply to say you favour a referendum. It's got to be official policy that Labour wants to remain in the EU.
I think for us, I think it's important, go back to the question, what's in the national interest? Where is the worker interest? It seems to me that when Boris Johnson wins, there's no chance of having frictionless borders if he gets his deal through. That is, to all intents and purposes, the end of British automotive manufacturing, something I've spent my entire life campaigning to defend. Japanese inward investment, the aerospace sector.
I don't normally dodge. Can I just be absolutely clear? I thought your position was Labour has to sign up for
Yes, I'm not dodging. I think under those circumstances, it would be impossible for us not to campaign to Remain and make the case for Remain.
But you've got to say it now, though, haven't you?
I think so. I think we're too late to say it. I think I would rather we'd have said it before the European Union elections, but I think we need to be decisive and do it with some humility.
And can I just, because Anushka wants to share just a few important stats with us, but before I go to her, just one final thing. Jeremy Corbyn, as I understood, said to you and your colleagues at Shadow Cabinet today that he'd recently been reading about how Harold Wilson conducted himself in that campaign. It was quite interesting that Wilson, in a sense, stood above the fray. You had Jenkins campaigning for Remain, Ben actually to take us out of what was then the common market. Do you think Corbyn would play a similar role of slightly standing back from the fray?
I think that wouldn't be unreasonable. Harold was a great man, and in difficult circumstances he held our party together. And I'm looking at Lucy over there. There's no way Jeremy's going to make Lucy do something she doesn't want to do. And so, we've got to be grown up about this.
Yeah.
But I do think the party should have a strong position so we can be clear with the country.
OK, that's very helpful. So this obviously does play into whether or not Labour can win back votes you seem to be losing at the moment. And Anushka, I think you've got some data on this you can share with us.
Yeah, because at that Shadow Cabinet meeting that you've mentioned, there was a leaked document that was circulated that suggested a more pro-Remain position wouldn't necessarily be good for Labour. Now, some of our geeks sort of jumped on that. They don't necessarily agree with that. Take Professor Rob Ford from the University of Manchester. He said you can't just say the seats we need voted Leave, therefore the voters we need in those seats favour Leave. You just can't. And people making this argument base it on data from people like Ian Warren that shows that even in Leave voting constituencies, the Labour vote is often driven by Remain supporters. And overall, Ian Warren has actually published data about the 2017 Labour vote and showed that over 7.5 million of those voters were Remainers, 3.386 were Leavers. That is 69.1% of the total vote. Now, Ian almost doesn't like to be dragged into the debate in Labour. He actually says that his spreadsheets have been weaponised in this debate, and it's not all about data. And I thought it was interesting that today he tweeted this thread from Labour's Lisa Nandy, who said MPs care about more than statistics, and here are a few things that they care about. Number one, the voters that they've lost over recent decades who share their values but think we no longer share theirs. One here, the people who aren't very visible in polls but are angry about a lack of compromise. And number five, keeping our promise. By that she means over Brexit. Yes, really. And that's why she's one of 26 MPs who have signed a letter urging against a second referendum. Robert.
So there is a sort of big question here for Labour. Overwhelmingly, all the data shows that Labour supporters and members want Labour to adopt your position, referendum and remaining. But, you know, in what were traditional Labour areas, there are often described as working-class Labour supporters who are angry about the shift in that direction. Do you just frankly write them off and say Nigel Farage can have them?
You don't write anyone off in politics. I mean, for me, though, it starts with forget where the polls take you. They help inform how you communicate what you think is right. And for me, I think it's right that we make the case for remaining in the EU and that we have a referendum. And what the polls actually show is that's where Labour voters are as well. I mean, it shows that people who voted Leave in 2017, three-quarters of them would now vote to remain in the EU. And they expect Labour to take a position. I think we were right in the early days to reserve judgment, to see how the negotiations went, what the priorities would be. But now they expect us to just give an honest account of ourselves. We can either be Leave or we can be Remain. And I think it is in the national interest we become a pro-Remain, pro-reform party and that we let the people have a final look at what any deal looks like.
I mean, there is evidence that even in Leave constituencies, on balance, Labour supporters favour Remain. But there are still quite large numbers of former Labour supporters who are desperate for Brexit. And there is a scenario that some of your colleagues are very frightened about, which basically says you've left it too late to persuade some of your core voters to come round to a Remain position. And if Boris Johnson does a deal with Nigel Farage and essentially gives, particularly northern constituencies, gives the Brexit Party a free run in some of your constituencies, you might see a hard Brexit a hard Brexit alliance between a Boris Johnson Tory party and Nigel Farage winning a majority.
Well, that might be the case. The argument would be that we need to have a completely alternative view of what Britain should look like. If anyone really thinks that Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage are going to stand up for the working people of Britain, then they're in cloud cuckoo land. But that's incumbent on us to have a clear position on Brexit, but also convince people that we want to transform the political economy, because people in the Midlands and the North have been losing out. There are too many losers in the economy. All those young people in the intergenerational divide who are entering the labour market with fewer rights, lower wages. We're not building enough homes for them. How are we going to transform the NHS? Our older folk who need social care. The white noise of Brexit is stopping us getting those messages over, and that's why we need a clear position.
I mean, it's almost impossible for anybody to talk about anything apart from Brexit at the moment, but I do want to bring Lucy in here. Lucy, you have been a Labour MP who has been campaigning for what most people think of as a softer form of Brexit. You haven't been, waving the flag for a referendum. That said, Liberal Democrats surging, taking share from Labour, Greens surging, taking share from Labour. Is Tom right that actually you can't ride both horses and actually you've got to become a Remain referendum supporting party?
Well, I think the sort of riding two horses thing is difficult. I mean, Brexit party surging as well, I would have added to your list. Look, I mean, I think Tom, he's the deputy leader of the Labour Party, and that's a role traditionally which is the voice of the membership. And I think he is advocating what the party membership absolutely want to see.
But you've had your doubts about that. Are you coming round to that position?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of becoming inevitable, but I think what Anushka was showing us earlier amongst some of that data, we cannot lose sight of that. There are many long-standing Labour voters, they might not have been Labour in 2017, but they were before then, who live in the Midlands and in the North, in my constituency as well, who did vote leave and who are really angry with us that Brexit isn't happening. And my main worry really about a second referendum is, would the result be any different? Because I've not seen any real evidence that public opinion has shifted, that the recent Euro elections showed us that the country was as divided as ever over Brexit. So a bit like Tom was saying there, I want to see us focusing much more on the deep root causes of Brexit. Why was it that so many traditional Labour areas and other areas voted leave? Because they're fed up of austerity, they're fed up of not having any opportunity, they're fed up of not having investment, of poor public services, of globalisation and businesses moving out of their town and their area. And we've really got to address that, I think, before we even consider going to another second referendum. Otherwise, we're going to get the same result.
I mean, it does seem to me that Lucy hits on a very important issue here, which is, even if there is a referendum, and whichever way it goes, we are still going to remain, almost certainly, a really divided nation.
Well, but it's a way of getting an end to this, isn't it? I mean, the reason I've...
Would it in reality be an
Well, I think it would. I mean, it would be the third time we've done this. Clearly, parliamentary democracy has let people down. Government have failed. We've had 3 years of paralysis in Westminster. We can't agree on a deal. But as Tony Blair says, it might be we can agree on a process to conclude Brexit. And I think that's the only way you can do that is reluctantly say to the people, here's the deal, take it or leave it.
And what's your message, just to be clear? The 26 of your colleagues who signed this letter, making it clear they're very worried about Labour moving in this direction. Many of them actually on other political issues would be very close to your position.
Yeah.
What do you say to them?
Well, look, I respect their position. The one thing about this debate is there's too much of questioning people's motive. The people who signed that letter strongly believe that. Now, I fundamentally disagree with them, but I don't. I'm not going to criticise them for because they're trying to stand up for their constituents as well. I just disagree fundamentally with them, and I feel very honestly we just have to be straight with the country. There's no way any political party is going to get 100% of its MPs back in any particular option. That has gone. We should just be realistic about that.
I think the idea of unity on almost anything at the moment in any political party is for the birds. Lovely to see you as always. Please don't go away, because after the break I'll be speaking to the unexpected